So let's jump right in. We're going to explore a really interesting question today. How does a sacred law that's centuries old deal with something totally modern, like praying in a skyscraper or a global pandemic? We're going to look at the surprising flexibility built right into Islamic jurisprudence, especially when it comes to the laws of prayer. And that's really the big question for us today, right? How can a legal tradition that's over 1,000 years old actually stay relevant? How can it give us answers for things like pandemics, massive overcrowding at the Hajj pilgrimage, or even just praying on the 100th floor of a building? Let's start with a challenge that I think we all remember pretty vividly.
Okay, so to get our heads around this, let's think back to something we all lived through not too long ago. An event that really forced people all over the world to rethink some very basic religious practices: the COVID-19 pandemic.
You know, when the pandemic hit, public health suddenly became everyone's top priority. And that created this huge problem for any religious community that's built around, well, gathering together. For Muslims, one of the most fundamental parts of daily life is praying in congregation, standing shoulder to shoulder in these really tight rows. So what on earth do you do when that very practice becomes a health risk?
Well, Islamic legal bodies all over the world had to respond. In places like Indonesia, they issued what are known as fatwas. These are essentially legal rulings. And these rulings officially allowed for physical distancing in the prayer rows. Now, if you know anything about the tradition, you know this was a massive change from how things have been done for centuries.
So that brings up a really important question. Were people just breaking the rules because it was an emergency? Or is there something deeper going on here? Is there actually a legal framework built into Islamic law that's designed for exactly these kinds of situations?
The answer is a definite yes. It's not about breaking rules at all. It's about applying this really sophisticated set of legal principles. You can think of it as a jurist's toolkit, and it's designed to make sure the law is both divinely inspired and also deeply in touch with human reality.
This whole system is called Fiqh, which is just the term for Islamic jurisprudence. And probably the best way to wrap your head around it is to think of it like a constitutional legal system. You have your foundational texts, sure, but you also have these core guiding principles that allow scholars and judges to interpret the law in a way that actually works in the real world.
Okay, first tool in the toolkit, rukhsah. This basically means a legal concession or permission. It's this idea that when you're facing a real hardship, the law gives you an alternative. So, a classic example, if someone is too sick to stand up for prayer, they're given the rukhsah to pray while sitting down. The prayer still has to happen, but it's made possible.
All right, building on that, we have darura, which means necessity. Now this one's even more powerful. It says that in order to prevent a much greater harm, something that is normally forbidden can actually become permissible. And this is exactly the logic that was used during the pandemic. The greater harm was the spread of a deadly virus. So protecting public health became the necessity that allowed for changing the prayer rows.
And the last key principle here is maslahah. This one is all about the public interest, the common good. It's a principle that lets jurists make rulings that are really for the well-being of the whole community. It's a really powerful idea that ensures the law is there to help society function and thrive, not just to check off individual boxes.
Okay, so you might be thinking, these principles like necessity and public interest sound great, but how do scholars actually decide when and how to use them? Well, it all goes back to the foundational sources of the law, and believe it or not, the centuries of debate that surround them. So Islamic law is basically built on four main pillars. You've got the Quran, which is the primary sacred text. Then you have the Sunnah, which are the practices and teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. After that comes Ijma, which is the consensus of the scholarly community. And finally, Qiyas, or analogical reasoning, which is how you apply old rules to totally new situations.
But, it's never as simple as just opening a book, right? Take hadith, for example. There's a whole science dedicated to figuring out if a particular report is actually authentic. A scholar can't just use any hadith they find, they have to be sure it's genuine before it can become a basis for law.
And this slide lays it out perfectly with two examples from the source material. On the left, you have an authentic hadith that says it's okay to delay the noon prayer if it's super hot outside. That's a valid legal basis. But on the right, a specific prayer ritual was ruled invalid because the hadith it was based on turned out to be a fabrication. This just shows how critical source checking is to this whole process. It's non-negotiable. But okay, let's say the sources are 100% authentic. What then? Well, this is where human interpretation comes in. Different scholars, using different methods, can look at the exact same text and come to different conclusions. And this diversity isn't seen as a problem. It's actually considered a feature of the system, leading to these different but equally valid schools of legal thought, or madhabs. Okay, get this. Here's a perfect and kind of wild example. It's about the rules for how a woman should dress during prayer. The question seems simple enough. Is the chin considered part of the face? Well, as you can see, two major schools, the Maliki and Hanafi, say yes, which means a prayer is still valid if the chin is showing. But the other two schools, the Shafi and Hanbali, say no. The chin is not part of the face, and so the prayer would be invalid if it's uncovered. It's a perfect example of how the same core texts can lead to completely different but valid legal rulings. All right, so we've got the principles, the sources, and this whole world of scholarly debate. But how does this all come together to solve real, messy, modern-day problems? Let's check out a couple of case studies.
First up, the Hajj pilgrimage in Mecca. Ideally, when you pray in a group, the rows should be perfectly straight and packed together, with no gaps. But what happens when you have millions of people crammed into one space? That ideal becomes not just impossible, but actually dangerous.
So what did they do? The jurists turned to that principle of maslaha, or public interest. Because there's this rich history of different opinions within the various schools of thought, they had a sort of menu of valid options to pick from. They chose a ruling that allows for gaps in the rows. It might be less than perfect in theory, but in reality, it prioritizes the safety of millions, showing how the law can adapt. Now, for a challenge that, there's no way the original jurist could have seen this one coming. Skyscrapers. Islamic prayer times are tied directly to the sun. Sunrise, high noon, sunset. But as anyone who's been up in a tall building knows, you can still see the sun from the 80th floor, even after it's already set for someone down on the street. And the solution here is just so cool and logical. The rulings are based on what you can actually see, on the direct astronomical phenomena. So prayer times are literally re-evaluated for different floors. This means that the official time for the sunset prayer on the top floor of the Burj Khalifa is a few minutes later than it is for someone at the bottom. It's a perfect case of jurisprudence engaging directly with modern science and physics. So when you put all of this together, from a global pandemic to the top of the world's tallest building, what's the big picture here? What does all this really tell us about the nature of this legal system?
Well, it shows that Islamic jurisprudence isn't some static, dusty set of rules from the past. It's a living, breathing tradition. It was designed to be a dynamic, ongoing conversation between its foundational texts and the messy, complicated, ever-changing reality of human life.
And that leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? If law, at its very best, is a conversation between the past and the present, one that adapts and interprets and responds, it makes you wonder, what are the most important questions, the biggest challenges, that we should be putting to our own legal and ethical systems today?